Welcome to Sophia's Emporium. My name is Suze, and today I have a rare reading for you. And it's out of a series of books called The Bibelot. It's a reprint of poetry and prose for book lovers, chosen in part from scarce editions and sources not generally known. What's interesting about this book, well, first off, it was sold by subscription only, and it's a series of 20 books. New York, it was printed, Thomas B. Mosier of Portland, Maine. It's a testimonial edition, and what you want to take note of would be that, what they used to call that, the Dewey Decimal System, 808.8 would be nonfiction, considered to be nonfiction. What was fascinating about this book originally is there are two in the series that actually speak about Sandro. And for those of you that follow the never-ending story, as wild as it may sound, I mean, we see Sandro in here from the 1700s and other dates in history. So we know these stories. But what's fascinating about this, and I know it will not win me points, is this is a story that hails from Ireland about the crucifixion. So that's what I'm going to bring you today. All right. We're starting on page 207, but the chapter actually begins all the way back on page 195, and it starts out in a series called A Little Book for John O'Mahony's Friends. And I thought that as hard as it is to keep people entertained, that I wouldn't start there. I would start on page 207 and then backtrack. So we'll get started. You know that Conall Carnac, the Lord of Dunsarvik, was present at the crucifixion? No? Well, all the nations of the earth were represented there, and Conall was for the Irish. He was a famous wrestler, and that is how he came to leave his castle of Dunsarvik, near Ballycastle, on the Antrim coast. He traveled all over the world wrestling, and took part in the gladiatorial games in Rome. Well, he came on to Jerusalem the very day of the crucifixion. He came up with the crowd just at the time Veronica gave the napkin to our Lord to dry his face, and he saw Simon help him to carry the cross. Everyone noticed his great size and beauty as he stood below the cross. While he stood there, a drop of our Lord's blood fell upon his head. That was the first Christian baptism of all Ireland. Then Conall saw the soldiers flinging dice for the seamless garment and said, "Let me have a throw." They agreed, and his throw of the dice won the prize, but he refused it because he had been profoundly impressed by the august death he had witnessed. Let me repeat that. He had been profoundly impressed by the august death he had witnessed. They say that each representative of the Gentile nations present that day was privileged to render our Lord a service. And Conall Carnac's was, they say the angel rolled away the stone from the mouth of the sepulchre for the resurrection. No. Then It was Conall Carnac that put his great shoulder to it and sent it spinning. He was the first to bring Ireland the name of Christ and the story of the crucifixion. And then again, it would be some homely saint of his own family. Saints? Sure, my own great-grandfather's mother's uncle, Father O'Brien, was a great a saint as any of them. We have his pikes in the family still. There was a young girl at Muskerry dying of a decline, and he was sent for to anoint her. She was the only support of her old father and mother, and a good girl she was. Well, he had given her the last sacraments, and was leaving her when she caught at his skirt. God, can you do more than that for me, she says. If you believe it, stand up and help your parents, he said, holding out his hand to her. She stood up, sound in life and limb, and lived to be an old woman. There was a little boy, a cripple, at Calcrea, and one day he sat on a ditch overlooking a field where there was a hurling match. He was very sad because he could never play at hurley. There were two men playing, and one cursed the other. The little cripple on the ditch rebuked the curser for the honor of God. Now, while this was happening, there came by Father O'Brien. "Why aren't you hurling, boy?" he asked. The boy pointed to his crooked limb for answer. "Go and play," said Father O'Brien. "Go and play." That was all, but the little cripple jumped from the ditch, ran into the field, and joined the play, using his crutch for a common. Those were the penal days, and it was not easy for a priest to live at all with a price on his head. But there were good Protestants who said it was hard that people shouldn't be allowed their own creed and their own minister, and it was in and out of their houses Father O'Brien lived. It was at the fairs he used to meet his people and move about among them as a drover, finding out when marriages were called for a christening and giving word of the place where the mass was to be said. Well, a scoundrel named R made a plot to seize and betray Father O'Brien. The family is known and disrespected in Cork to this day. He got a half a dozen scoundrels to assist him, and they joined the priest as he was leaving the fair at Ballinhassig and entered into conversation with him. Now, they had to cross the Lee at a certain point by stepping stones, and midway the stream, R tripped Father O'Brien, and he fell and lay in the stream. And all the time he was carrying the sacred host in his breast. Well, they tied him up, and then and there took him to the house of a gentleman named Gilman, who was a magistrate, or whatever corresponded to in those days. He was one of the good Protestants, and when the scoundrels had taken themselves off, he gave Father O'Brien his liberty. Of the men who had betrayed him, all died violent deaths within a few years, except old R, and he lived and apparently thrived. But in his old age he was following a fox hunt, and he had seen hard after the fox crossing the hill of Carval. Well, it might as well have been a hill into the other world, for after he had topped it, tale or tidings of him no man ever heard. His horse was found drowned some time after, just floating out of the river to the sea. I could tell you scores of such things. It's 1,000 pities you haven't the Irish. The Munster peasants are full of stories, not only of Christ and the saints, but of heroes and chieftains. Did you ever hear that Hugh O'Neill only said two tender things in all his life of hard fightings. One was to his wife, Mabel Bagnall. The other was to Hugh O'Donnell. It was at the Battle of Kinsale. Over all the roar and tumult of the battle, the old chieftain could be heard calling to the young one, who was flashing through the battle like a brand, Thorin na cha oda, which is, keep close to me, Hugh, keep close to me, Hugh. Then there was a grand man, Donald the Bastard, of who I have many stories, but I will tell you those another day. Write them down, I used to say, write them down. But he was not much good at writing down, and he was ready to give his stories away to anyone who wanted them, although at the back of his mind he had the intention always of writing some day. Indeed, he began a novel or two and laid them aside. There was nothing he possessed he would not give away. You had only to tell him that you had an order for a story and could not find a plot, an occasion for an article, and could not find a subject, and he was thoughtful for a moment. Then he would give you his plot or his subject. Perhaps one part of the truth about him was that he could not write for money. In his college days, he shouldered the editorship and practically all the work of an archaeological journal, which brought him little fame and no fortune. Only he loved doing it. Later, he was on circuit, solicitors clamoring for him. He would find time to write long letters, full of stories, now and again a folk story or a legend. You should weave it into a ballad, the story of St. Gobnet, the little patroness of Ballyverney, and whom so many county Cork girls are called. It is Englished Abby. She was a sea king's daughter, and he was a shrine robber. She had no sisters or mother, and used to keep the ship with him and his men. Once she was ashore in a wood, and God sent an angel to tell her to fly from her father, and to give her life to himself. Well, she would, but she knew of no place of security. The angel told her to travel and give no rest to the sole of her foot until she would find 9 white deer asleep. She went on, and she came to a place and found 3. She fondled them for a while, and then went on to Kilbnanet, where she found 6. Here she stayed until they were all good friends. Then she left her heart with them and went on to Ballyverney. There, as God willed it, she found the 9, and she made her dwelling with them, and they became her sisters. And she died in the midst, and is buried there. Everywhere he went, he met with the most delicious adventures. Wherever he goes, something is bound to happen, said one who preceded him into the shadows. Indeed, all life conspired to make mirth and adventure for him. For some 2 years before his death, he suffered greatly, but his suffering is out of sight. A superhuman courage enabled him to keep the signs and portents of those years. For the one who loved him best, he was ordered rest, 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 an impossible prescription to him. Sure, he wouldn't take over himself, said a homely lover of his sins, and who could blame him? I hear that when he came out of court, there was a row of cars waiting for him, and probably people fighting for who'd have him. Probably there was some truth in the picturesque statement. He was the best and gayest company in all the world. On circuit, he was always called up to the judge's table. He could be as audacious as he liked with the big men of his own, or another profession. He only provoked smiles and honest laughter wherever he went. Thus ends part 1. What about these cars? Talk soon.